Who authorized this? The question came out sharper than Daniel Whitmore intended, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the restaurant like a crack in glass. But no one answered. Not yet, because the moment hadn't happened. This was minutes earlier, when everything still felt predictable, when Power still sat comfortably in his tailored suit and gold watch, when the only thing that caught his attention was a phone that didn't belong in a place like this. The dining room glowed under soft amber lights, crystal glasses reflecting quiet wealth, the kind of place where a steak cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and Emily Carter moved through it like she was part of the background, silent, precise, unnoticed. Until she wasn't. Daniel saw at the moment she set down his water, the phone in her hand catching the light for just a second too long. It was old. Not vintage. Not stylish. Just old. Scratched edges. Faded screen. The kind of device people replaced without thinking. He let out a small laugh before he could stop himself, leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowing with mild amusement. "Does that thing even connect to anything?" he asked, not cruelly, not loudly, but just enough for the table to hear, just enough to establish the difference between them. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. She simply placed the glass in front of him with steady hands, the ice shifting softly as it settled. "It works fine, sir," she said, her voice calm, even untouched by the tone he had used. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her now, really studying her for the first time. There was something off about the way she held herself. Not defensive, not eager, just steady, like she wasn't playing the same game. He'd built an empire reading people in seconds, identifying weaknesses, leveraging them, turning every interaction into an advantage. And yet, this woman gave him nothing. No nervous smile, no attempt to impress, just quiet presence. It irritated him more than it should have. "I suppose you don't use it for much then," he continued, tapping his own phone on the table, the latest model, sleek and flawless, a subtle flex he didn't even think about anymore. No apps, no upgrades, just calls, a pause, just a fraction of a second. Then she met his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just direct. "I use it for what matters," she said. That should have been the end of it. A simple exchange, a forgettable moment. But something in the way she said it lingered, like a note that didn't resolve. Daniel looked away first, waving his hand slightly, as if dismissing the thought, already turning back to his menu, already moving on. Because in his world, details like that didn't matter. Or at least, they weren't supposed to. Across the table, one of his associates chuckled quietly, picking up on the earlier remark, but Daniel didn't join in this time. His attention flickered, just briefly, to the phone again as Emily stepped away, placing it carefully into her apron pocket, screen facing inward, like it wasn't meant to be seen. Like it wasn't meant to impress. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that bothered him more than if it had been brand new. Daniel Whitmore had spent 15 years building systems that moved billions of dollars with a single command. So when his phone buzzed in the middle of dinner, he did not think twice before glancing down, expecting routine updates, predictable numbers, controlled outcomes. But what he saw made his fingers pause just above the screen, not frozen, not yet, just slowed in a way that rarely happened to him. Because the notification did not follow the usual pattern, the formatting was different. The authorization tag, unfamiliar, and for a brief second, he assumed it was a minor glitch, something his team would resolve before it even reached his attention. So he placed the phone back on the table, exhaling quietly, returning to the performance of control that had defined his entire life. While across the room, Emily Carter continued moving between tables with the same measured rhythm, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing in the world could disrupt the quiet order she carried within her. And that contrast, subtle but persistent, began to pull at Daniel's focus in a way he did not appreciate. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at his associates, offered a comment about market volatility that drew polite nods, but his mind was no longer fully present, because something about that notification lingered, like a detail that refused to be ignored, and without fully deciding to do so, he reached for his phone again, this time opening the alert, this time actually reading it. The room seemed to soften around the edges as his eyes scanned the lines. System override. Tier 7 authorization. Transaction approved. Amount, $280 million. His jaw tightened slightly, not in panic, but in calculation, because numbers like that did not move without him, not without layers of approval, not without his direct involvement. And yet the timestamp was real, the confirmation code valid, the system's signature unmistakable. Someone had access. Not just access. Authority. Daniel leaned forward, elbows brushing the edge of the table, his voice lowering as he spoke to the associate beside him, asking a quiet question that did not match the casual tone of the dinner. But before the man could respond, another notification appeared, this one more precise, more direct, cutting through any remaining doubt. Source device, Legacy Offline Authorization Unit. Registered owner, E. Carter. The name did not land all at once. It slipped in slowly, almost unnoticed, until it connected, until his eyes lifted, almost instinctively, scanning the room, searching not for a threat, but for an answer. And there she was, near the far table, placing down a plate with the same calm hands, the same steady expression, the same old phone resting against the fabric of her apron, invisible to everyone else, irrelevant to anyone who measured value by appearance. And suddenly, the earlier laughter echoed back in his mind, sharper now, heavier, no longer harmless, because the equation had changed, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not feel like the one in control. Daniel Whitmore did not stand up right away, because standing would have made it visible, and visibility meant loss of control, something he had trained himself to avoid at all costs. So instead he remained seated, fingers lightly resting on the edge of the table, eyes fixed across the room as if he were simply observing the rhythm of the restaurant. But nothing about his focus was casual anymore, every detail sharpening, every movement slowing down, as though the world had shifted into a different frame rate where only one thing mattered. And that was understanding how a waitress with an outdated phone had just authorized a transaction his own executive team could not access without layers of biometric approval. He exhaled slowly, once, controlled, then reached for his phone again, scrolling through the system logs with the precision of someone who had built the architecture himself, confirming what he already suspected but still needed to see in black and white. The authorization key matched. The encryption sequence aligned perfectly with an early version of the system, one that had been retired years ago, or so he thought, one that only a handful of original architects even knew existed. And suddenly, the timeline began to rearrange itself in his mind, not in panic, but in realization, because that version had saved his company once, during a crisis that almost erased everything he had built, a silent intervention that appeared out of nowhere, executed flawlessly, then vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a single line in the audit history and a question no one could answer. Across the room, Emily placed down another plate, nodding politely as a customer thanked her, her expression unchanged, her presence as quiet as it had been from the beginning. But now Daniel saw something else, something that had been there all along but had not registered, the absence of hesitation, the lack of performance, the way she moved without needing approval from the room. And it unsettled him more than any direct confrontation could have. He pushed his chair back slowly, the subtle scrape against the floor barely noticeable to anyone else, and stood, adjusting his jacket out of habit rather than necessity, his steps measured as he crossed the dining room, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving with the same controlled confidence that had defined every negotiation, every acquisition, every decision of his career. But this was different, because for the first time in a long time, he was not approaching a situation he understood. Emily sensed him before he spoke, not because she was watching him, but because she was aware in a way that did not rely on sight alone. And when she turned, her eyes met his with the same calm clarity as before, no surprise, no curiosity, just recognition of his presence, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Daniel stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the illusion of composure, and for a second, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching just long enough to shift the balance of the interaction, because this was no longer about status, no longer about wealth, no longer about who held the power in the room. It was about truth, and truth did not respond to titles. That authorization, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, it came from you. Emily glanced at him, then down at the check in her hand, setting it neatly on a nearby table before looking back up, her expression unchanged, her voice quiet but unmistakably certain. "It came from the system," she replied. Daniel held her gaze, searching for something, a hint, a confirmation, anything that would restore the logic he was used to operating within. But there was nothing there to grab onto, no explanation offered, no need to defend, just a steady presence that did not bend under scrutiny. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore understood something he had spent his entire life avoiding. That power did not always announce itself. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room was the one no one thought to question. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately, not because he lacked words, but because every instinct he had relied on for years was suddenly misaligned, and reacting too quickly would mean admitting that he did not fully understand the situation. So instead he stood there, composed on the surface, calculating beneath it, while the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm around them, glasses clinking softly, low conversations flowing, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted between two people standing less than 10 feet apart. He studied Emily more closely now, not as a waitress, not as part of the background, but as a variable he had failed to account for, and the realization did not sit well with him, because his entire success had been built on anticipating outcomes before they unfolded. That system should not be accessible from any external device, he said, his tone controlled, precise, the kind of voice that usually directed entire teams into motion. Emily adjusted a fork slightly on the table beside her, aligning it with quiet care before answering, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the weight of his words. "It is not external," she said simply. Daniel's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, because that answer did not resolve anything. It only deepened the question. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice further, creating a private space within a public room. "That architecture was retired," he continued. 5 years ago." A pause. Then, for the first time since he had approached her, Emily allowed the faintest shift in her expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, just a subtle acknowledgement of something unspoken. "No," she said quietly. It was preserved. The word lingered between them, and Daniel felt it settle into place like a missing piece he had not known he was searching for. Because preserved meant intentional. It meant someone had seen value where others saw obsolescence. It meant someone had made a decision to protect something he himself had dismissed during an aggressive expansion phase, when speed mattered more than legacy, when efficiency replaced caution. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization pressing in, not overwhelming, but undeniable. "Why?" he asked, and this time the question carried something different, not authority, not challenge, but genuine need for understanding. Emily met his gaze steadily, her eyes clear, her posture unchanged, as if she had been waiting for that exact question. "Because the new system had a blind spot," she said. Daniel's mind moved quickly, reconstructing possibilities, scanning for vulnerabilities he had overlooked, but the more he searched, the more he realized that the answer was not something he could access alone, and that realization, subtle as it was, marked the first real shift in the balance between them. "And you fixed it," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "I prevented it from becoming a problem," she replied. No pride, no emphasis, just fact. Around them, the world continued as if nothing had changed, but for Daniel, the noise had faded into something distant, irrelevant, because in that moment, the person he had dismissed minutes earlier was no longer just someone he had underestimated. She was someone who had quietly shaped the very foundation of the system he controlled, and the realization did not come with embarrassment or anger. It came with something far more unfamiliar, something he had not felt in a very long time. And it was respect, quiet, unforced, undeniable. Daniel Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar deals across polished boardrooms and private jets. But nothing in those carefully controlled environments had prepared him for the quiet certainty standing in front of him now. Because this was not a negotiation, this was not a power play, and for once, there was no advantage to be leveraged, only a truth that had already unfolded without his permission. He glanced down at her hands briefly, steady, precise, the same hands that had just moved hundreds of millions of dollars through a system he believed only he controlled, and then back up to her face, searching again for something that would restore familiarity, but finding only that same calm presence that did not ask for recognition and did not react to scrutiny. "You have access that even my senior engineers do not," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, not demanding, not accusing, just stating what he could no longer deny. Emily did not respond immediately. She reached for a glass at the table beside her, refilled it with water, the soft sound of liquid meeting ice filling the brief silence, then set it down with care before turning back to him. "They have access to what they need," she said. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that usually came before a decision, but this time it did not lead to action, because the situation was no longer something he could direct with a simple command. "And what do you need?" he asked. The question landed differently than the others, less about systems, more about her, and for the first time, there was a shift in the air, subtle but real, as if the conversation had crossed an invisible line. Emily held his gaze for a moment, not measuring him, not judging, just seeing him in a way few people ever did, beyond the suit, beyond the title, beyond the control he projected so effortlessly. "Very little," she said. Daniel almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but out of recognition, because people who needed very little were the hardest to predict, the hardest to influence, the hardest to control, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight he could not ignore. Behind him, one of his associates called his name, a reminder of the world he came from, structured, responsive, predictable, but he did not turn right away, his attention still fixed on the person in front of him who had just rewritten the terms of the interaction without raising her voice, without asking for anything in return. "You could have come forward," he said, his tone softer now, almost reflective. "Taken credit. Taken a position." Emily shook her head slightly, the movement small, almost imperceptible, but decisive. "That was never the point," she replied. Daniel studied her for a long second, and something inside him shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because for the first time in a long time, he was facing someone who was not interested in climbing, not interested in proving, not interested in the currency that defined his world, and it forced him to confront a question he had not asked himself in years, not about her, but about everything he had built. "Then what is the point?" he asked quietly. Emily glanced down briefly, her fingers brushing the edge of her apron where the old phone rested, then back up at him, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "Making sure it works when it matters," she said. And just like that, the conversation settled into something deeper than status, deeper than roles, something that did not need to be explained to be understood, and Daniel Whitmore realized that the moment he had laughed was not just a mistake, it was a reflection of everything he had overlooked. Daniel Whitmore had always believed that control came from visibility, from knowing every moving part, from having systems that responded instantly to his decisions. But standing there now, he was forced to confront something far less comfortable, the realization that the most critical part of his empire had been shaped by someone who had chosen to remain invisible, someone who had never asked for recognition, never stepped into the spotlight, and yet had influenced outcomes more profoundly than most of the executives he paid millions to advise him. He glanced once more at her apron, at the faint outline of the phone resting beneath the fabric, and for the first time, he did not see it as outdated or insignificant. He saw it as intentional, as something that existed outside the cycle of constant upgrades and displays of status that defined his world, and that shift in perception, small as it was, carried weight. "You stayed," he said, almost to himself, the words forming before he fully processed them. Emily looked at him, not questioning, not confirming, just present. When everyone else moved on, he continued, his voice quieter now, more reflective than authoritative. "When the system changed, when the company scaled." Emily's response was simple, but it carried a depth that made him pause. "Someone had to understand what was left behind," she said. Daniel let that settle, his mind tracing back through years of expansion, acquisitions, upgrades, decisions made at speed, decisions that prioritized growth over continuity, efficiency over memory, and he began to see the pattern not as a series of successes, but as a sequence of omissions, things he had assumed were no longer relevant, things he had trusted others to manage, things he had not questioned because the results had always looked strong on the surface. Behind him, the dinner continued, his associates, now speaking in lower tones, sensing the shift without understanding it, while the staff moved around them with practiced ease, unaware that one of their own had just altered the internal landscape of a company worth billions of dollars. That transaction, Daniel said, bringing his focus back, it was not random. Emily shook her head slightly. Nothing in a system like that is random, she replied. He nodded once, absorbing the answer, then asked the question that mattered most, not as a command, but as a request for clarity. What did it prevent? Emily's eyes held his for a moment, and in that silence, there was no tension, no resistance, just a quiet decision about how much to say. A cascade, she answered finally. One that would have looked small at first. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Because he understood cascades, he understood how minor misalignments could amplify across interconnected systems, how something barely noticeable in the beginning could compound into something irreversible, and the fact that he had not seen it coming unsettled him more than the event itself. And now, he asked. Emily glanced toward the window briefly, where the city lights reflected against the glass, then back at him. Now it will hold, she said. There was no emphasis, no attempt to impress, just certainty. And that certainty carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because it did not rely on persuasion. It relied on understanding. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, the space between them unchanged, yet entirely different, because the dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as he finally turned slightly, acknowledging the world he had momentarily stepped away from, he realized that the regret he would carry from this moment was not about the comment he had made earlier. It was about how easily he had dismissed something that did not fit his definition of value. Daniel Whitmore returned to his table, but he did not sit immediately, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if the simple act required more consideration than it should, and for the first time in years, the environment around him felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed, but because he was no longer seeing it the same way. The polished surfaces, the quiet luxury, the subtle signals of status that once reinforced his position now seemed almost shallow. One of his associates spoke, asking a question about the deal they had been discussing, something about projections, timelines, expected returns, but Daniel did not answer right away, his gaze drifting briefly across the room again, landing once more on Emily as she moved between tables with the same composed rhythm, unaffected by what had just transpired, unaffected by him, and that, more than anything, stayed with him. He finally sat down, slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but his posture had changed, not visibly to others, but internally, the certainty that once anchored every interaction now replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. We will revisit the numbers tomorrow, he said, his voice steady but different, less performative, more grounded, and his associates exchanged brief glances, sensing the shift without understanding its source. The conversation attempted to resume, but it lacked its earlier momentum, because Daniel himself was no longer driving it. His attention divided, his thoughts returning again and again to the same realization, that the most critical safeguard in his entire system had not come from a boardroom, not from a consultant, not from a strategic acquisition, but from someone he had dismissed within seconds based on nothing more than appearance. He picked up his glass, took a small sip, then set it back down with care, the sound barely audible, his movements slower now, more intentional, as if each action carried weight. Across the table, one of the younger associates attempted to lighten the mood with a casual remark, something about outdated technology, something meant to echo the earlier tone of the evening, but Daniel did not respond, not even with a polite smile, and the comment faded quickly into silence, leaving behind a subtle tension that no one addressed. After a moment, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not to check notifications, not to assert control, but simply to look at it, the flawless surface reflecting the soft light of the room. And for the first time, it felt less like a symbol of success and more like a limitation, a device that showed him everything except what actually mattered. He placed it face down on the table, a small gesture, but one that marked a quiet shift in priority. His gaze lifted again, finding Emily once more, and this time, there was no trace of amusement, no residual judgment, only a steady recognition of what he had almost missed entirely. She finished setting a table, adjusted a napkin slightly, then moved on, her presence unchanged, her role outwardly the same. And yet, in Daniel's perception, everything about her had transformed, not because she had revealed something new, but because he had finally seen what had been there from the beginning. The check arrived shortly after, placed neatly at the edge of the table, and Daniel glanced at it briefly before reaching for his wallet. But his movements paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because for the first time, the transaction in front of him felt insignificant compared to the one that had just taken place without a receipt, without acknowledgement, without applause. He signed the bill quietly, his handwriting precise, then stood once more, this time without the need to adjust his jacket, without the need to reinforce his presence. And as he turned toward the exit, he stopped for a brief moment, just long enough to look back, not at the room, not at the table, but at Emily. And in that silent glance, there was something unspoken, something that did not need to be expressed to be understood, because respect, when it is real, does not ask for attention. It simply changes the way you see everything that comes after. The night air outside was cooler than Daniel Whitmore expected, a sharp contrast to the controlled warmth of the restaurant he had just left. And for a moment he stood still on the sidewalk, not checking his phone, not calling his driver, not moving at all, as if the momentum that usually carried him from one decision to the next had quietly faded. Cars passed. Lights shifted. The city moved the way it always did, fast, indifferent, efficient, but Daniel remained where he was, his thoughts no longer racing ahead, but circling back, again and again, to the same moment, the same voice, the same calm certainty that had dismantled his assumptions without effort. He finally stepped forward, sliding into the back seat of his car as the door closed with a soft, precise sound, the kind that usually signaled a return to control, but tonight, it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, just altered. "Office?" the driver asked. Daniel paused, looking out through the window at the passing reflections of the city lights before answering. "No," he said quietly. "Home." The word lingered, unfamiliar in its intention, because going home was not part of his usual pattern at this hour, not when there were numbers to review, decisions to finalize, strategies to refine. But something in him had shifted, something that no longer felt aligned with the urgency he had built his life around. The car moved smoothly through the streets, the steady hum of motion filling the silence, and for once, Daniel did not fill it with calls or emails or instructions. He simply sat there, his gaze unfocused, his mind replaying details he would have dismissed just hours earlier. The way she had answered without hesitation, the way she had moved without seeking attention, the way she had spoken about systems not as tools of power, but as responsibilities. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, turning it over in his hand, studying its flawless surface, the edge-to-edge display, the seamless design, everything about it engineered to represent progress, to signal success. And yet, for the first time, it felt incomplete, not because it lacked function, but because it lacked intention. He placed it beside him on the seat, not face down, not hidden, just set aside, as if its importance had quietly diminished. When the car finally stopped, the building rose in front of him, glass and steel reflecting the city skyline, a structure that bore his name, his legacy, his control. And yet as he stepped out and walked toward the entrance, he felt a subtle distance from it, not rejection, not detachment, just a recognition that something fundamental had been missing from the way he had seen it. Inside, the lobby was silent, polished, precise, everything in its place. And as he crossed the floor, his footsteps echoing softly, he glanced at the security panel near the elevator, a system he had personally approved, a system he trusted completely, and for a brief moment, he wondered how many layers existed beneath what he could see, how many decisions had been made beyond his awareness, how many safeguards he had benefited from without ever questioning their origin. The elevator doors opened, and as he stepped inside, he caught his reflection in the mirrored surface, the tailored suit, the composed expression, the image of control that had defined him for years. And yet behind it, something had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The doors closed. The ascent began. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Whitmore was not thinking about what he would do next. He was thinking about what he had almost failed to see. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. and Daniel Whitmore stepped into the quiet stillness of his penthouse, a space designed to reflect success in its purest form: clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that stretched across the city like a reminder of everything he had built, everything he controlled. And yet tonight, it felt different, not empty, not hollow, just incomplete in a way he could not ignore. He walked slowly across the room, setting his jacket aside without thinking, his movements lacking the usual urgency that defined him. And when he reached the window, he paused, looking out at the endless grid of lights below, each one representing a system, a decision, a life moving forward whether he noticed it or not. For years, he had believed that influence meant visibility, that control meant awareness, that success meant being at the center of every important decision. But now, standing there in the silence, he understood something far less comfortable: that the most important things in his world had not required his attention at all. They had existed, quietly, operating beneath the surface, sustained by people who never asked to be seen. His phone rested on the table behind him, untouched, the screen dark, and for once, he did not feel the need to check it, because whatever updates it held no longer felt urgent compared to the realization settling into him. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on the reflection of the room in the glass, and for a moment, he saw not the polished image he had cultivated, but the absence of something he had overlooked, something that could not be measured in numbers or displayed in reports, something that had been standing right in front of him earlier that evening, unnoticed until it chose to reveal itself. Emily Carter. The name settled into his thoughts with a quiet weight, not as a curiosity, not as a problem to solve, but as a reminder, a fixed point that redefined the way he understood everything around him. He walked back toward the table, picking up his phone again, not to assert control, but to confirm one final detail. And as he opened the system logs once more, the line was still there, unchanged, precise, undeniable. The authorization that had prevented something he had never even seen coming, executed without recognition, without announcement, without expectation of reward. He stared at it for a moment, then slowly set the phone down, not with frustration, not with relief, but with acceptance, because for the first time, he was not trying to own the outcome. He was simply acknowledging it. The room remained silent, the city beyond the glass continuing its endless motion, and Daniel Whitmore stood there, not as the man who controlled everything, but as someone who had finally understood the limits of that control. And somewhere, miles away, in a quiet restaurant where the lights would dim at the end of the night and the tables would be reset for tomorrow, Emily would continue her work the same way she always had, without needing acknowledgement, without needing validation, because her purpose had never been tied to recognition. It had been tied to something far more enduring. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried for years easing in a way he had never anticipated, not because he had solved a problem, but because he had finally seen it clearly. And in that quiet moment, with nothing left to prove and no one left to impress, the lesson settled into place, simple, undeniable, and impossible to ignore, that the people you overlook are often the ones holding everything together, and the things you dismiss are sometimes the only things that truly matter.